My name is Helen Robinson. I went back on a second visit to UCT to do postgraduate work. And after doing the first stages of that, it was suggested that I write a doctorate. I'd always wanted to do that because I live in Wynberg and the place fascinated me, which is why I wanted to live here. I decided, after going down to the archives, and I realised that there hadn't been much work on Wynberg, that I had to decide how I was going to present it very carefully. Because in the interim of all this, we had apartheid, which meant that the two Wynbergs were separated. Above the line was set aside for the Europeans, and below the line for people of colour. I wasn't very happy about that, but I thought, right, well, I'll tell the story. And in the course of this story, I discovered that it was a mixed suburb. And people had been distributed throughout the area which came to be known as Wynberg. Well, one must begin at the beginning, and I will tell you that I'm going to divide it into 4 sections. The first section was before the settlers arrived in the southern part of Africa. The people who lived in the area, which we today call Wynberg, were the Khoisan people. And they had discovered the many conveniences of Wynberg long before later people did. There was plenty of water, a good water supply. There was shelter. The weather was quite good. And they decided to set up their own little establishment on the slopes of Wynberg Hill and a little bit round onto the Constantia Berg, as it was later called. And so therefore, they had taken possession. They were nomadic people who moved about with their cattle. They had a few cattle and other animals, and they did settle here and there for a while, but they were essentially nomadic. So they moved about, and until the beginning of the 17th century, there had been very little interference, because the settlement as such had spread out from Table Bay, but the Wynberg was quite a convenient marker of a boundary line. So beyond the Wynberg, in the initial stages of settlement, they didn't give out farms. Jan van Riebeck was granted a farm on the town side of the Wynberg, but very few farms were granted initially in this Wynberg area. After a while, about 4 governors later, 4 commanders of the settlement, Simon van der Stel arrived. Now he came out to Weinberg and stood on Weinberg Hill. He looked down into Constantia Valley and he realised it was a wonderful place. He had no opportunity to go and live there initially, but because of his good work, he was granted a huge farm which stretched from roughly where Weinberg Hill is, all the way down to near Musenberg, to Sternberg. Now, when he was granted that farm, or before he was actually granted that farm, he had decided to give out some properties in Weinberg area. So he gave out 3 farms, one up on the hill, one down, further down towards where we would say Constantia is today, and one further down, which was in what we would call across the line, the railway line, and that was known as Rust en Werk. And he gave out these 3 farms, and they were established well, and then the decision was taken to put a military camp, a defence, up on the hill, which was a good vantage point, and there would be a military deployment there. Now that's how Weinberg, as such as we know it today, came into being. A grant of 3 farms. Now it didn't end there. By this time people were realising there was good land out beyond the Weinberg. They were accustomed to going along the wagon road, along the wagon road, which stretched all the way from Table Bay right through along to False Bay. Initially to Cork Bay, but then to Simonstown. And I need not tell you, Simonstown means it was established at this time as an extra harbour, more sheltered. Now you will see that Weinberg, as such, was centrally situated in the South Peninsula. Excellent position, because it in later years would have access to all the land developing round about it. And it began to be regarded as the centre point. And because it was a centre point, other people now began to set up small businesses in the area, aside from the farms, which operated as farms. And because they did that, a small village developed up on the slope of the hill below the military camp. And that was known as Klein Oder. Now, Klein Oder was probably 10 houses, 2 or 3 of which were shops. And that's where Weinberg started. The road from Cape Town developed a branch off, more or less where Witten Road is today, a little before Witten Road. Today we call it Allable Road. And it goes down towards the slope of the hill and then visits the little village which developed there, goes through it, and then down from that, back to the wagon road, at what we call today Plumstead. And I mention this because initially Plumstead was not the name given to the place we call Plumstead today. One of the people who applied for land down below the wagon road was a man named Henry Batt. And he was a sailor, actually, on a boat that visited the Cape. And he liked what he saw at the Cape, and he emigrated with his wife to South Africa, or to Wynberg. He chose a farm which was roughly below the area where the station is today. Perhaps a little further to the right-hand side, but it was a big farm, and he decided to raise cattle there. Now, by this time, there were a number of small little establishments, houses and tiny shops, and the Khoi people had moved further away. They were nomadic. It was perhaps more straightforward to them than for some other people. But some stayed and still inhabited the mountains round about. And this is how Wynberg became basically an interracial suburb, initially a small village. There was a mixture of the racial groups. The other thing that, contributed to that was that quite early in the 17th century, about 1860 or 70, I'm wrong, 1650 or 70, they decided to follow the custom, which was general by that time in outlying areas, to take slaves to work in the fields for the settlers. And this is what happened in Wynberg. The farms in the area all had a number of slaves brought to them to work and run the farms. They also moved into the little village, and there was quite a bit of interaction. So you had the beginnings of a village surrounded by 3 more or less undeveloped farms, big ones. There was a smaller area round about Whitton Road where they weren't offering large farms, and quite a few of the people of colour in Wynberg were able to settle themselves there in time, another couple of 100 years. When slaves were freed, they were able to settle in the areas between the old farms and the area we call Kenilworth today. Now, this is how the place was shaped, how it developed. Now we have to look at the people who came there. And this, of course, is the basic part of the story, and it's what I'm most interested in. I work in the deeds office for my research quite a lot. So I mapped out the whole area of Weinberg. And I was then able to go to the deeds office and research how the properties were subdivided in later years, where some of them new areas were granted, and why I was able to determine. Because in those days, if properties were owned by people of colour, it was stated. And the others, obviously, it was not. Now, what happened was that the big farms began to be subdivided, the three big ones, because it was too big. As time went on, Weinberg began to be seen as a good place to live, safe because it had protection, and easy to find a living there. Initially, there was no, how can I put it, there was no segregation at all. And in fact, there was quite a lot of intermarriage between people of colour and the European so-called settlers. There was also interaction with the men who lived in the military camp. And in fact, as time went on into the next century, a group of local people were recruited into a unit which was called the Cape Corps, and they were people of colour. Many of them had been ex-slaves who'd been freed. Others were simply recruited from people who were living in Weinberg as slaves. And so you saw a greater degree of interaction between people, because the Cape Corps was one of the main service units in the area. The other people were mainly members of the British Army, of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company Army, who were recruited from various international sources of people who wanted to join an army group. So you were getting a great deal more variety of people coming into the area. And of course the slaves provided that too, because they had been recruited, taken in from their natural places of residence and brought to the Cape from a number of different places, countries. And when they settled down, they too intermarried with the local people. So you were rapidly now developing a population which was quite mixed. And this was an interesting feature, because they were living well away from Cape Town centre. There was quite a lot of variety, I will say. in the population. Initially, the 3 farms, as I say, were large. And the story of my work there became discovering how those larger farms were subdivided, who were able to buy them, did they bring slaves, more slaves into the area? Did some of them co-opt some of the local people, the Khoisan, who were still about? And obviously one of the reasons why the Dutch East India Company maintained a contact with all the local people was that they were cattle breeders. They had cattle. And the objective of the settlement in Table Bay was to provide food supplies, water, to the ships which were visiting, trading ships that were visiting the country. Wynberg became a source of supply because some of the people who'd come to the Cape from the Dutch East India Company was a variety of nations who came. They decided to be more independent, and the company decided they would like to have the best of both worlds, people who would farm and supply food for the ships coming through, and also a group of people that they called the free burghers. Now the free burghers were officially employees of the Dutch East India Company, but that was a fairly loose arrangement. And some of these people chose to buy land in the outlying areas where they were allocated, and they became, shall we say, the first inhabitants of the village of Wynberg. It was not only settlers. A number of the people who lived in the area, some owning small farms, others working on the farms. They began to make their own way, if you like. And it was very interesting to note that it didn't take too long before they were doing so. Throughout the 16th, the 17th and 18th centuries, as the village was developing and subdivision was taking place on the farms, these people they became more independent, let's put it that way. They continued to fulfill their obligations of supplying food to the camp, for the camp. They continued to supply food for the Dutch East India Company vessels coming through. But they also started local trading. And in fact, when they later extended a grant to Simon van der Stel in recognition of the good work he'd done for the Dutch East India Company, and gave him a huge farm beyond Weinberg, which Simon van der Stelke named Constantia. He must have been actually quite pleased that his first view of the valley below Weinberg Hill had come to full possession for him. By now, it was a neighborhood. You had a group of people who were depending on small shops, small businesses, small farms, and it was an interesting combination of people. And it was an integrated community. The area below the wagon road, which some people call East Weinberg today, I prefer it to the name Lower Weinberg, which it was initially given. And that area became a source of trade and travel, because more and more people began to use the wagon road to go down to the False Bay area and indeed to Constantia. And so Weinberg's position as a central place was very valuable. You could reach from there all round the area. And so therefore, Weinberg was really becoming a residential suburb or village as much as it was working farms. Now this produced a very interesting situation, and I was able to look at the social developments in the area and what happened. Now, initially, there was only the wagon road. And then later, other roads were introduced in and out of the area, which meant that what is today the main road in Weinberg village became a gathering point. People from the more outlying areas could come into Weinberg and go to the shops there. They could also bring their own products in. So Weinberg was now regarded as a central village with surrounding residential area, plus a military camp up on the hill, and it began to have a social relationship with everyone. Let's for a moment think of the sort of people. We know that there was a mixed community there. We know that they came from different levels of society. Some were more well-to-do than others. But by and large, they were an interdependent community. They were far away from Cape Town. They needed to be. They had other developing areas round about them which were becoming dependent on them. And of course, more people arrived. They saw opportunities for starting businesses in Weinberg. It's interesting that the Constantia farm never created a village. They relied on Weinberg. They used to come into Weinberg. In fact, coming into shop in Weinberg became quite a nice thing to do. The people who were further out began to move into Weinberg. Now, before we come to individual people, bear in mind that when people gather like that in one area, at that time we got now to the middle of the 18th century, and various social structures were needed. In those days, the Church of Holland, the Dutch East India Company, was the one that was dominant. And so therefore, there were meetings of the Dutch Reformed Church, which had started in Cape Town, and that was where its centre was. But there were small meetings conducted. Now, many of the people who were, shall we say, drawn into the European community were dependent on church services, which were conducted initially up at the military camp, because that's where there were ministers of religion. And later, the church became a structural feature. And in fact, at one point, towards the end of my research in Weinberg, I counted more than 20 churches in this one little village area, which included by now the area of the 3 farms, the first farms, which had been subdivided over time. And this, over time, created a quite interesting situation. Towards the end of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company began to have problems. There was too much competition from other European countries where people were trading with the Far East, and they weren't making the money they made initially when they made their first arrival and settlement at the Cape. In the end, they went bankrupt. I won't go into all the details of that because it complicates matters, but they found themselves unable to continue. And historically, if you add the fact that in the period towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, a dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte was busy creating war in Europe, which disturbed much of the trading patterns and the possession of land in Europe. The Dutch, unfortunately, suffered badly. The Dutch East India Company failed in the end, and they asked Great Britain, who was also in the trading business and opposing Napoleon's conquest of Europe, because they didn't want to be next on Napoleon's list. And so they allowed the the Dutch allowed Britain to adopt a caretaker position in relation to the Cape. They were a much bigger power than, say, Dutch, Holland or France or the surrounding countries. And they took over the Cape with the agreement of the Dutch East India Company. And that was at the end of the 18th century. After the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt, the British took over the Cape in 2 occupations, and then the British finally took it over entirely after the second British occupation. There were differences in administration because Britain treated the Cape as part of their empire. And so therefore there was oversight from the government in Britain, and they also created structures in southern Africa to carry out their wishes. Now this comes in direct link with the people, because under the Dutch East India Company, they were principally from Europe, and they were people from the Far East too. But what is interesting is that when the British came, there was a distinct resentment because the big bosses back in Holland wanted it. The local people had acquired a confidence and a, settled feeling, and they didn't really want it. They wanted to stay as they were. However, the British were fairly tactful, which is why there were 2 occupations and why British ownership was introduced gradually. However, you now have another element. There were British people at the Cape. So your population had increased. The nature of your population was changing. The early people had more or less established themselves as a farming community with a smaller commercial element. Some of the commercial element has been quite good. And when the British took over, and the local people didn't have to regard the Dutch East India Company's oversight, the British were quite willing to let them develop their own style of government in the British framework. And they were trying to encourage more cooperation between the 2 groups of people. Now this led to a different sort of development. Let us go back for a minute and think about the early development of Wynberg. I've already stated that the people who came were roughly members of the Dutch East India Company. They were working people. They were bosses, the upper crust, and they were slaves. Now, when the British came, they introduced a number of new ideas. They took over the Cape in 1806. They didn't take it over without a bit of a battle. They arrived, there was the Battle of Blouberg, in which the British landed and literally fought a battle to take over the Cape on the white beaches of Blouberg. Then they marched into Cape Town, having defeated the local army force, and took over, literally. This was received with some, I won't say resentment exactly, though it was, but the local people were not pleased. They'd set up a system of farms, later a subdivision of farms. They developed relationships between the various places, and consequently they didn't want to change that system. When the British arrived, they wanted a different system. And more importantly, they weren't the same people who'd come into the country that had been living there now for a couple of 100 years. And there was a problem. But strangely enough, in Wynberg, which was why I was particularly interested in it, there was a definite move to try and integrate both the ownership of property in Wynberg and the ideas of the British, which were different from those of the Dutch East India Company. Just to give one example, a number of the British people who came into the country in the early 19th century were in favour of emancipating all slaves. And that was a system which had been recognised by the Dutch and the other European countries. And they didn't really want to give it up. But the British insisted. They set a date, which was in the 1830s, and by that time all slavery would cease at the Cape. So it wasn't an easy takeover. And Wynberg was part of it. Because after all, there was a military camp at Wynberg. And when the British arrived, they realised there was resentment, and they installed a proper British camp up on the same site on Wynberg Hill. Okay. Now, this had a mixed reception. But I've mentioned this first because I would like to go back and just indicate the types of people who had taken for granted that the routine they'd established in Wynberg, the social structure, was going to go on exactly as they'd intended. And it wasn't. The British decided that they did it quite gradually and quite tactfully. But it was different. I cited slavery as an example of one of the things they were changing. But there were lots of other differences too. And there were people who resented quite definitely the British arrival. Now this meant that instead of a group of people who had been more or less of the same mind living in Weinberg, new people arrived and were wanting to buy farms, wanting to take over control, and that created problems. The other issue which arose was that many of the slaves who had been working since the beginning in Weinberg were of the Islamic sector of religion. Some of them brought with them their own beliefs and systems. Others adopted and transferred these to the Cape. And Weinberg was an interesting example because there was a strong Muslim community in the area, which already existed in the slave community. Now, the Dutch East India Company mainly exercised their church attendance in their time at the Cape, either from going into Cape Town itself to the Goeie Kerk, or to attend services up at the camp, and later they built the Dutch Reformed Church close to the camp. Initially, a little cottage which was attached partly to the camp on the hill and was known as the Glebe Cottage because it was near the church. This cottage had served as a meeting place for religious services. It had a link with a camp. It had been allocated from ground, which the camp had appropriated. And the Dutch Reformed Church, of course, was directly aligned to the church in Cape Town. The people who were in the Dutch Reformed Church weren't too happy with the whole situation. But by and large, when the British came along and they established in Glebe Cottage the small church that was to be for the British, the English church, they were a bit taken aback. However, initially there was a fair amount of share and share alike until the British established their own church, which was at St. John's Church up on the hill, and later the Wesleyan Church was established, the Baptist Church, and much, much later the Roman Catholic Church. And it's interesting to see that over time the church has established a relationship in Weinberg between all those churches. There were about 15 churches of all sizes in Weinberg by the time I finished my research. So it took time, but they came to agreement. One of the things that the church was very much responsible for was social connections between the population. For starters, they were going to abolish slavery, which means that a large section of the population would become free people. They were also different from the other church. on the hill. And these were issues which had to be resolved. I'm glad to say that mostly they were resolved. But it wasn't easy. It was an accommodation of people who had grown to a certain way of thinking and feeling, and people who had not. It's interesting to note, historically, that after the British came and settled themselves in the little village and on the hill in the camp, and then moved down into the more eastern end of Wynberg, the churches quickly established churches down there too. So there was an acceptance of the fact that the population were not all British. The original population was important. Now this is one of the features of the next 100 years. And unless one understands that about Wynberg, it was not only a mixed race community, it was also a community of people who made compromises. And somehow or other, they managed to get the British and the original group to recognise that. Now, there were a number of people who were quite determined not to do this, inevitably. Some of them joined some of the others who had left the area and went away. They took part in the Great Trek by the middle of the 19th century, and they were determined not to come back. But the people who stayed behind reached actually quite a remarkable compromise. And one of the very interesting features in Wynberg is the marriages that took place across both the colour line and also between British and people of Old Cape origin, who'd been there since the VOC descendants. And that's why Wynberg has had a slightly different composition very often to many other places in Cape Town. And one of the interesting things that interested me particularly. I shall pick up the talk from where I left off yesterday. I tried to give you the whole foundation of the village in that part of the talk. Today, I'm going to talk about the people who were involved in building up the village. We must therefore go back to Simon van der Stel. And we must think for a moment that he was having his first look around this part of the peninsula, a part where he would later have his own farm. So he went up onto the hill at Wynberg to get a good view of the whole area on the other side. And he liked what he saw. And he realised it would be a very good place to settle some more people. He therefore decided to grant 3 main farms in this area, plenty of space, and he put the first farm, which was just behind where Jan van Riebeck's farm had been granted on the other side of Wynberg Hill. The wagon road through to False Bay came across the bottom half of the valley. He then decided he'd give the first farm out from the top of Wynberg Hill down to where the river ran through the valley. He arranged that it would be up onto the hill on the other side, what later became the Constantiaberg. And he granted this farm to one of his executives. It was a very neat little action because he wanted it for himself, actually. And after about a year, he did in fact buy it from the man Harmon, and he granted it to him. So in fact, the first farm he granted up on the hill in 1682, he owned. However, this plan didn't quite work out because the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was so pleased with the work he was doing at the Cape that they decided to give him his own farm, and they gave him a huge stretch of ground from almost the Wynberg mountain right across to Steenberg, near Musenberg. It was about 800 morgen. And this was a bit embarrassing because he'd just taken delivery of this farm at the top of the hill going down into the valley for himself. So he quickly transferred that farm to his two elder sons. The one was Willem, the other was Francois. So they in fact owned the first farm granted in Wynberg. The second farm he granted was down on the flat section below the rise of the hill. And this farm was taken over by one of the other people who worked for the company, Linus, his name was. And then he gave a third farm out. Now this one was down on the east side of Wynberg, and on in fact the wagon road to False Bay went through that farm, and that he called Rust en Werk, with the emphasis on the werk. And he gave that out to a group of 3 men who were not executives, they were ordinary free burghers, you know. And they were to run that farm as a cattle farm, because there was good water there and there was good grazing. So that is how Wynberg started, as a group of 3. Then he realized that they would have to have a military camp somewhere in order to keep an eye on the place, that nobody else decided they wanted to come onto it without permission. So therefore, he put a small military camp up on the hill. By this time, they had a few people of colour who were in a small regiment, and they were the first people to live in the military camp up on the hill. The other group of people were settled down on the flat part, beyond the farm he'd granted down there. 2 farms. And he then went about his own business, And was given Kurt Constantia, and it was a bit of an embarrassment, but he got going on that, and he left the other farm to his sons. Now after that, in the beginning of the 17th century, Simon van der Stel retired round about 1700, and another governor came to take over from him. That governor was also quite interested in the developments out here. But in the meantime, the people themselves had begun to get to work. One man came and started a small general store for supplies, down on the corner where the road came down from the wagon road. A side road came down. In fact, that was the first road. It came down from the main road that came out along from Cape Town, and it crossed up to the farm and the military camp. So they would have access for their wagons to come straight up to the farm, the military camp at the top of the hill. This was a good idea, because then another branch went down to join the main road again, where we would call Plumstead today. So those two roads still exist and are used regularly. One of them is Gabriel Road. Now, the other one is called Animal Road. Now, this gave good access for wagons and coaches to travel out to Wynberg. And this was the beginning of Wynberg being thought of as a place where you could get supplies. There was a shop that sold everything, the old-fashioned farm store. And that was down on the corner at the foot of the hill where the military camp was. Now, some of the military men had their wives with them, and children too, and they were living in tents up at the camp. So the military guys who had some money looked around and thought, we'll get a bit of land here and build a house, a proper home. And they did so. In fact, two young men approached the governor and said, look, we would like to try and get some land. Now, the whole bit across the bottom of where Wynberg village is today was owned by the government. They hadn't given it to anyone. And so therefore, they decided they would give them a couple of pieces of ground at the foot of the hill below where the military camp was, near to it. And these two young men married local women. In the meantime, Sassman, who was the man who had the little store, the general store, at the foot of the hill, he had married a woman named Rachel van der Kaap. And this was the beginning of the multicultural nature of Wynberg. He built himself a house near to the shop, which was conveniently on the corner of the road where everybody could get to it. Those two buildings, or the originals of them, were on that corner and still are today. Because the little village that began to grow up as other people saw the benefits of coming out to Wynberg and starting a business. There were shops that dealt with looking after, say, horses, and remember, there was no mobile transport other than by horse. So they needed people to service the horses. They needed people to provide supplies for horses. And gradually, over a period of about 20 years, the whole place began to change. Now, time had gone by, quite a lot of time, when it was simply 3 farms, all working farms. But now there was a change, because we'd reached the 19th century. In 1795, the Dutch East India Company ceased to exist. The Cape was no longer so profitable. There were a lot of other people in competition with them. The French, the English, were also trading and using the Cape. And they couldn't sustain supporting a settlement which had grown. It had spread out from Table Bay, and the settlement there, the castle, and it had moved out into the areas between Cape Town and the 3 farms at Wynberg, other farms. And so therefore the wagon road was much more used, and although the little village had started near to the military camp where their first customers were, they now began to develop the area along where we would say the main road is today. So this is the way the village spread out, down towards the east side of Wynberg, all open country. Now, this produced almost a double village. You had a village up on the hill near to the military camp, and you had a second village developing near the main road. Therefore, a lot of other people now began to move out to Wynberg. There were, initially, when the British took over the Cape, first of all in 1795, when the VOC closed down, and the King of England made an arrangement with the Prince of Orange, who was in Holland, to take over the whole place on a caretaker capacity. Because the man who was causing all the trouble in Europe at that time was Napoleon. And the Emperor Napoleon in France was busy occupying more or less the whole of Europe as we know it today. Therefore, the Cape became more independent in the hands of Britain, and Britain had not been conquered by Napoleon, being separate from Europe in Britain. Now, this is why the place changed hands. The Dutch were no longer in a position to have the place there. And the Dutch retained control to some extent up till about 1806, when at the Battle of Blouberg, the British took over the Cape officially. They didn't actually get possession of it till about 10 years later, when, special documents were signed. And from about 1812, the British now controlled the Cape. Now, this resulted in British people in the intervening 10 years had come out to staff all the government posts in Cape Town. And they were living in the area all the way down from Cape Town to Wynberg. Some bought houses and farms. Others saw Wynberg and they liked that. And they came out to Wynberg, particularly the contingent of military men who were now moved up onto the hill from down below, and the camp as we know it today came into being. Now, the next thing to happen, inevitably, was who was in charge of Wynberg. And in a sort of natural takeover, the man who was in charge of the camp took over. Now, the military camp initially was staffed by mercenary soldiers who were paid to be soldiers for the Dutch East India Company. The British brought in their own men, obviously. They had quite a powerful army. And therefore, it was a mixed community of the old Cape residents, people who were of Dutch, German, French descent, and British people. Now you had a bit of a problem because there were also people of colour living in the area. I touched on this in the first part of my talk because it's important. A number of those earlier settlers had married local people, and therefore they were mainly descendants of slaves by this time. Slavery at the Cape was not abolished until the 1830s. So there were still living slaves in Wynberg, because as they'd been worked as farms, therefore they needed people to work the farms. So there was quite a large slave population in Wynberg. Now, the people who came out with the British were not really farmers. The senior officers of the camp, what they wanted was a nice house with a good big garden. And that was when the subdivision of the three farms began. The farm Oude Wynberg was actually divided into about 5 pieces. And 2 of them were quite influential men. The one was the commander at the camp, who was still a man of Dutch origin. And there's a rather amusing in one way and sad in another little story about that, because he had the Oude Wynberg farm, and he lived here, right next door to the military camp. And one day he popped home from Cape Town. They used to go into Cape Town quite regularly, and found that his wife was entertaining another man at the farm. And he caught them in a very embarrassing situation. And this was the result of the first divorce in Weinberg, because he immediately divorced his wife. Men could do things like that in those days. And in the divorce settlement, because the Dutch had very definite laws about that, husband and wife were always joint owners of whatever property was there. It was registered in both their names. Therefore, she had to get one half of the Oude farm. And that is where the division started. Because in his divorce settlement, he gave her the upper side of the farm nearer to the military camp, and he kept and later sold the part up on the hill, Weinberg Hill. After that, the rapid subdivision started. Now this was in the early part of the century, the 19th century. And this is where Weinberg really came into existence. It resulted in Oude being bought by a couple of men who had already got Cape ties, and they settled on the farm Oude. However, the one man didn't like it, Reynolds, and he left. The other man was not a farmer. He was at the camp, you know, and his interests were in that. And he therefore made the first major subdivision of the Oude farm. A shrewd man. He sold it in 5 pieces and got money for it. And so the first subdivision, major subdivision of Oude was accomplished. The 5 people who bought, there were a couple of soldiers who bought. There were a couple of people who came from Cape Town who bought. And they all set up, most of them, in some form of business. Because by then, there were quite a lot of soldiers at the camp and local people living here on the farms. And they needed supplies, they were actually growing things too by this time. Because when the Dutch left, their obligations to the East India Company ceased. And so they were able to market whatever they grew on the open market. And because there were a lot of other people between Cape Town and Weinberg, there was quite a demand for supplies, because they didn't want to go all the way to Cape Town to get them. And in this way, the main road down in Weinberg developed, and it soon became a busy highway rather than just a little old wagon road. Meanwhile, up on the other part of the farm, the other farms were also dividing. Now, Linus, the man who had bought the farm nearer to Constantia, He also sold his farm to a doctor named Glaser, and his daughters had married the two young men who had bought farms from the government at the top of where Maynardville is today, just below the camp, and the little village that was developing on the hill. And his daughter, or daughters, actually became residents when he bought the other farm at Weinberg. Now, at the same time as that, with the main road being more active because of the regular traffic along it, to get out to the further developments on the way to False Bay, shopkeepers opened up on the main road as well. One of them was a man named Raycliffe. Now, he had an interesting background. He was a wagoner. In other words, he was a transport man. He brought people and goods to Weinberg. Now, in the process of doing that, he made quite a bit of money. He was a man not of mixed blood, but he'd been at the Cape for a while, and he made an interesting marriage. He married the daughter of the Imran of Cape Town, who had married a European woman. And their daughter married Raycliffe. Now, Raycliffe had made quite a bit of money in his travelling back and forth and carrying goods and people. And he bought a large chunk of land on the main road to the east of Rustenburg. And that went down approximately as far from the main road as down to where Rosemead Avenue and the Prince George Drive is today. So it was a big farm. And he went on living there, and he and his wife had children who also worked the farm, and he opened a general store on the main road in Weinberg. Now you had two villages developing. One up on the hill, which went across onto the Weinberg Hill. The other one from Weinberg Hill down to the lower part of Weinberg, on the lower level. And both farms were now really villages, two separate little villages. Now, this was quite a big development for the place. And more people came in. Soon you had the village with about 6 shops at the top, doing various things. People who are operating in the village, doing work for other people. So it was developing a community. The people down on the main road overlapped with them. And one of the interesting things is that until that time, there'd been no actual, a development of religious form in a church. And that's unusual because in those days, churches were the sort of community centre of any little village. And so therefore the Dutch Reformed Church decided they would build a very simple church in Weinberg. And they put it down below the military camp, at the sort of halfway down the hill, where the first little village was, near the camp. The English church had been operating as the Dutch Reformed Church had done before them, and they had shared a cottage which was on the upper slopes of the hill. It was called the Glebe Cottage, and it still exists. More or less exactly modernised in the same form that it was. Outwardly it looks the same. It was a big cottage, a long cottage. And in that cottage they used to meet for religious services before there were churches. They also had a small post office operated by local people, and they used to bring people down there who needed medical attention. There's a small sort of type of hospital, or what we would call today a medical centre there. Now this was a change, because it means that the Weinberg was beginning to operate separately from Cape Town, the government in Cape Town. They were running quite a few of their own affairs, because once the Dutch Reformed Church had been built, small though it was, the English church thought, well, they better do the same. And they built a church too. That was a little further over towards the farming area. Now by this time, the farm, Oude had changed possession because of the divorce of the governor of the camp. And a man named Hare, William Hare, had taken over the whole Oude farm. And he was an officer at the camp. And he decided he would sell the farm in portions, keeping only one section where the farmhouse was, at the top of the hill, for himself. He didn't want a lot of farmland. He had 14 children in the process of his marriage, so he contributed quite notably to the population of Weinberg. But he was also responsible for the 5 other farms which grew up, small farms, round about him, and for the link of the land between the main road and the farm on the hill. So Weinberg was developing a more united front. It was no longer 2 villages, one on the hill and one down below. It was more or less one place. And very soon after that, the churches were responsible for setting up a small school, which they did on the corner of the road that came down to the camp from the main road, Allowell Road. And the school they set up there was for boys mainly, because girls didn't have much education in those days. But there were a few girls in the school. But as the little school developed, so the girls left. They established another school nearby in a cottage. which was actually started by one of the British governor's wives. When Durban came as governor to the Cape, his wife, Lady Durban, set up a school for girls by about 1835. Now, there weren't many schools for girls in those days. I mean, they weren't considered, they didn't need an education. And so Wynberg established itself not only as a fairly independent place, because they had a lot of people coming into it to buy stuff, but also it established a reputation for good education. They were lucky, they got good people. The girls were set up in this other cottage, which today is the Museum for Education Conservation. It remained right through the school that Lady Durban set up for girls. They were taught very basic education, reading, writing and arithmetic, and that was it. But the other school for boys developed very well indeed. And they kept a pretty high standard for those days. So now you had churches, you had a school and a girls' school next door, where they were mainly taught how to be a good housewife, Now, beyond that, there were shops down on the main road which were beginning to look quite big. I mean, it was a general store in the middle there, and it did quite good business. There was also another man named Witten, who was an English immigrant to the Cape. Now he set up a very important service in the Cape, with all the coaches and wagons that were moving now backwards and forwards along the main road at Whitebank. They needed servicing. There had to be a stop for the horses who lost shoes and therefore needed to be reshod. Sometimes they had more requirements, and certainly a place where horses could be watered. It was a long trip through from Cape Town to False Bay and the Constantia area. And Witten set up a sort of the first type of horse garage. And he sold stuff. He serviced the horses. They had a blacksmith there to reshoe the horses. And Wynberg was becoming more and more a sort of centre where you could get things done and keep things going in the Cape. So Witten's was on the corner of the main road, and a road which was later given his name, Witten Road. And that's where that comes from. The Witten family became quite a central family in Wynberg. By now, business people were arriving in the Cape. The British regarded the Cape in a much more business-like manner. And they said they brought out a lot of professional commercial people. They brought out a lot of professional people, lawyers, doctors, businessmen. And Cape Town was growing into a Dekapse flat, and no longer just more a small town. So the importance of Wynberg grew because people were travelling regularly now between the False Bay area and Cape Town along the wagon road. Wynberg became the central point. People would come in from Cape Flats to Wynberg. People would come from the Constantia side to Wynberg. And people would come on trips from town. They came to visit the people at the military camp. And they came to visit friends who were now moving out to Wynberg. They established a bus service in 1830. It was a pretty ramshackle old affair, where you had people sitting on top of the bus as well as inside it. And this was being run by a local man. And of course Raycliffe was also still running his wagon trips to and from Cape Town with supplies and people. So it was becoming quite a busy place. Not long after that, more people began to move into the other half of Wynberg. The area on the hill was mainly occupied with about half and half, British people and people who were old Cape families. Many of the slaves were being freed because the British brought in the freeing of slavery over a period of time. It all climaxed round about the 1830s, between 1834 and 1838, when it became official that you could no longer own a slave. The British Parliament passed an Act of Parliament. So there were a lot of people who were looking for occupation who had been slaves. Now the lower part of Wynberg had not really been developed on either side of the main road. And quite a few slaves managed to purchase small properties down there. And the British government were quite happy about that. By this time they'd established a deeds office and it was all being done officially, Similarly, up on the upper side of Wynberg, they were doing the same thing. The bigger farms were being subdivided. And 2 or 3 people emerged from this group of people. One was a man named John Higgs. And he was British, but he had come to the Cape during the changeover between Britain and the Holland, the Dutch East India Company. And John Higgs came out, he was a sort of farmer, and he bought a farm which had come on the market because the man who had it, who had come out to the Cape on one of the boats, he had, decided to leave the sea and come ashore. And he'd opened a very profitable wine trading business in Cape Town. And he decided to buy the farm, part of the farm which Raycliffe had owned, the lower part of the farm further down onto the Cape Flats. And he called his farm Plumstead. Now, that was a little village outside London where he would be born. So he called his farm Plumstead. And that is why there's always been a bit of a confusion that there was a Plumstead down on the main road overlapping the Wagon Road, and there was another Plumstead which grew up much later nearer to an inn on the Wagon Road, because now people were establishing places where travellers could stop. And a well-known one was called Rothfelder's Inn, which was beyond Wynberg, just outside the limits where Wynberg had formed the village. And people used to stop over there for holidays, and travellers would have meals there. Now this was changing the character of the village, because people saw there was a place for people to come and stay. And a couple of inns opened up. One was opened down on the main road, nearby where Raycliffe and the others were living. On the east side of the road, they had the land that went down beyond the main road. And this one was above the main road. And this coincided with the arrival in Wynberg of two men who literally changed the whole way Wynberg developed. Because John Higgs had bought land which was available near the main road. Now these two men, one was named James Maynard, were also immigrants. Now the British Army was not interested, as the VOC had been, in developing anything in the village. So the government took over more specifically in Wynberg, and the deeds office began to sell properties in Wynberg. And the young couple who had married Glazer's daughters, they left. One of them was killed, actually, on the eastern frontier of the Cape, in the wars that were there, where the British were expanding their colony, and the other one left. He left relations in the village, but not in the farms they'd originally bought. And when the widow Ellerman, as her name was, she died, no, her husband died, on the frontier, she needed money, so they sold the farms. Now this man named Maynard had come to the Cape with his family to settle. And he did settle. He started up a very profitable business, which was money lending to people who needed money to buy property or start businesses. He was the first financier who came to Wynberg, in a small way at first, but soon in a big way. He arrived here shortly after 1820 for the first time, and he went out and saw the place, and he realized that the three farms surrounded quite a big bit of government ground, which had sort of been left for the army camp. They used to ride up and down to the water, the river. There was a big river running through the bottom side of Wynberg. All these rivers are now underground in pipes today, so you don't really notice them, except that one crossed over to join the river called the Deep River further down, beyond Wynberg. And this river changed the face, really, of what Wynberg was, because it provided water running through now the middle of the village. And James Maynard decided he would buy the whole area. And he picked it up at a good price, and he built a house there, a big house, a good house. The other man's name, he was had actually been born at the Cape. He was not an incomer. His family had emigrated to the Cape and had actually been living in Wynberg. The arrival of James Maynard in Wynberg and his purchase of a large strip of land which ran roughly from the old village down to the village on the main road was the thing that changed the shape of Wynberg. More people began to spread out further to the edges of Wynberg, and suddenly the area on the other side of the main road became important, because that was where there was more land available for people to spread onto. And this was when the east part of Wynberg really developed. As I said, the families who went there, a number of them were of origins of freed slaves. They bought land round the various commercial enterprises that were opening, and they opened up commercial enterprises of their own. Freedom was something that they wanted to maintain. And so people began to seek education, and the churches began to supply more educational facilities. There wasn't only the boys' school up on the hill. Now there were other schools opening up with all the churches in the east side of Wynberg. This is a very important move, because where the east side was, they often supplied educational facilities as well. And this was precisely what happened. Because now there was quite a large Islamic population, principally of freed slaves, but also descendants of freed slaves and of people who had intermarried with the settlers coming from Europe. So you had a large population of people of colour, as well as, so to speak, a European population, ex-Europe, mainly English speakers, but a lot of people who also spoke Dutch from the previous occupation. Another man who arrived was his father came first to Wynberg to work. He bought a piece of land. His name was Morganrood. Dominicus Morganrood. And he also was a man who had a bit of money, and he was prepared to buy land. So at this crucial point in the development of Wynberg, you had three men who were making investments in Wynberg. One was John Higgs, the other was James Maynard, and the third one was Philip Morganrood. Now these men systematically marketed property.